A cockatoo's beak, streaked in someone else's blood, would become the clue that finally stopped a killer. The image is disorienting. A white crest drooped against a collar, tiny talons curled, a smear of red across a feather that, at first glance, looked like a tragic aftermath of a house attack, but investigators in Dallas were not satisfied with first impressions. In each of the cases that follow, an animal, beloved, ordinary, familiar, entered the scene not simply as a companion to a victim, but as an unexpected witness. Sometimes their bodies bore traces of a struggle. Sometimes their behavior led officers to doors that ought to have been knocked on sooner. Sometimes their very sounds were a record of the life inside a home, repeated until they became, in effect, an audio ledger of abuse. These were not sensational miracles. They were, instead, moments where biology and behavior intersected with police work and forensic science, changing the direction of investigations that might otherwise have stalled. The people at the heart of these stories were not defined by how they died. They are remembered by what they loved, the lives they led, and the families they left behind. The animals that survived, or in some cases did not, became part of those families' stories and part of the evidence that brought accountability. If you appreciate stories where unlikely allies helped bring justice, take a moment to subscribe for more real-life investigative accounts. On Christmas Eve in Dallas, neighbors noticed that something in Kevin Butler's row house was different. The lights were on, but there was no sign of the man who, friends said, kept a busy door for strays and gave what little he had to the animals that wandered his neighborhood. Officers forced the door and found Butler lifeless on the living room floor. Beside him, a white-crested cockatoo sat, badly injured. The bird, known simply as Bird, had been with Butler for months, a fixture on his shoulder as he moved through the house. What the first officers on scene did not fully understand was that Bird's injuries would speak in a language that only late-night lab technicians and painstaking detectives would translate into a name. Initial scene work was standard. Tape went up, photographs were taken, biological samples collected. Investigators documented a living room that showed signs of a struggle and collected anything that might connect a person to the scene. Fingernail scrapings, traces of blood on a couch, a kitchen knife from a drawer. Bird, however, became a separate line of inquiry the moment first responders noticed the bird's beak and claws were stained with blood that did not match the victim. For months, the case trudged through labs. Crime scene technicians sent swabs away. The samples were small and delicate, a mixture of avian tissue and human blood that made extraction difficult. As reported in court papers and in interviews with the lead detective, what initially seemed like a routine homicide investigation became an interlocking series of forensic puzzles. Detectives Michael DiNardo and Brett Molden, working with forensic analysts, had to establish whether the blood on Bird belonged to Kevin Butler or to someone else, and if it was someone else, whether that someone would ever be identified. It was the kind of forensic work that demanded patience. Human DNA on bird beaks and claws is neither common nor easy to retrieve, and the laboratory timeline extended to months. When the lab finally returned a result, it surprised everyone who had briefly assumed Bird's injuries were merely collateral. The DNA on Bird did not belong to Butler. It matched a man who would eventually be named as a suspect. The identification led to an arrest. As the prosecution later argued in court, and as recorded in trial transcripts, the presence of foreign human DNA on Bird's beak and talons placed the suspect at Butler's home at or near the time of death. Prosecutor George West captured the unusual nature of the evidence with a line that reverberated through courtroom coverage. This bird spoke. The phrase was not a flourish. It was a sober summation of how biological traces from an animal had provided the linkage that human witnesses and surveillance had not. Kevin Butler had been known by neighbors not for fame or wealth, but for small acts that make communities endure. He took in animals other people discarded, fed them, and let them and bird into a stream of days that neighbors recall with a mix of affection and loss. Bird did not survive the injuries sustained that night. The bird's death became another wound for Butler's circle, and a reminder that the lives we tend often carry the record of our end. Investigative work did not stop with the DNA hit. Detectives corroborated timelines, interviewed people known to have had contact with Butler, and compiled phone records. Yet the fulcrum of the prosecution's case remained biological. DNA on a pet that established a physical presence at a time and place where other evidence was more circumstantial. When the case moved to trial, jurors heard about swabs taken from a beak and from talons, about the painstaking hours technicians spent separating minute human cells from bird tissue, and about the months it took for a profile to emerge. In that courtroom, the domestic intimacy of a cockatoo, its perch on a man's shoulder, its call filling a room, was reframed as the last living witness in a night that might otherwise have dissolved into uncertainty. The man identified through that DNA was arrested, convicted, and sentenced according to the court records presented at trial. For Butler's friends, the conviction did not erase the grief, but it gave a measure of closure that otherwise might not have been possible. Bird's remains were recovered and, as reported by family and officers, the bird was mourned by those who remembered a small, noisy companion who had, in the end, identified a threat no human had been able to name. Not every piece of biological evidence is simple to interpret. Forensics exists at the joint between possibility and probability. A DNA match is rarely the whole story, and in this case, the match on Bird's beak and claws formed a pivotal, and jurors were asked to weigh it alongside the rest of the case. The scientific testimony explained the procedures and the statistical likelihoods, while the human testimony brought texture. Neighbors recalling conversations, friends describing Butler's affection for animals, and detectives explaining why Bird's injury merited attention. Together, these threads transformed a domestic tragedy into a prosecution that led to a verdict. A few months after the Dallas case closed, in a different state and under vastly different circumstances, a golden retriever named Joe would repeat the pattern of an animal altering the course of a criminal inquiry, this time not through blood and DNA, but through motion and insistence. It was 3 a.m. on a cold night in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, when a patrol officer spotted a loose dog running down a residential street. The animal, mud-caked and shivering, did what dogs often do. It sought the person who mattered most. Officer Joseph Ziegler, trained to respond to animal calls with caution, followed the collar and found himself at the front stoop of a house where the porch light was still on. The door opened, but not to a living man. Inside, Fred Boot lay dead. The scene bore signs that police would later say were consistent with both violence and an attempted destruction of evidence. Joe, the golden retriever, did not leave the property. He paced, whined, and eventually led officers to a back entrance, where investigators discovered impressions in soft soil and the remnants of an attempt to burn an item, shoes, according to reports, nearby. Those impressions were documented, photographed, and later compared to footwear found in the possession of a suspect. In a case that included arson and attempted cover-up, the dog's presence at the scene offered a living anchor for timelines that otherwise might have frayed. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. Detectives collected prints, photographed patterns of damage, and, importantly, tracked a series of human movements the night of the crime. Surveillance footage, hospital records, and a tip from a member of the public coalesced into a path that led officers to Rinaldo Mercado, who, as the prosecution later presented, had been injured in the days after the killing in a way that attracted medical attention. A hospital intake, as reported by investigators, matched a pattern of wounds consistent with the timeline established by emergency calls and evidence at the scene. What the case crystallized into was not a single forensic marvel, but a mosaic, a dog who would not give up the place it called home, boot prints and burn marks that suggested an attempt to erase traces, surveillance that placed a person near the location, and a tip that made a connection between those fragments. The suspect was arrested after investigators pieced together these elements and, during legal proceedings, was convicted. For Boot's family, the legal outcome was a formal acknowledgement of responsibility, but it did not return the man they had lost. Joe, the dog who had refused to leave the scene of his owner's death, survived. He was taken in by Fred Boot's son, Brian Boot, who later spoke to reporters about Joe's quiet, steadfast presence in the days after his father's death. The dog became a small, living repository of memory for a family navigating grief. In the aftermath, there was also a local effort to honor Fred Boot's life, including a modest scholarship as reported in community accounts, an attempt to create something forward-facing from a rear view of sorrow. The Wilkes-Barre case illustrated another essential element of modern investigations, the way ordinary behaviors, an animal returning home, a person seeking care at a hospital, aggregate into patterns that, with time, point towards accountability. Joe did not speak. He did not bear forensic samples that could be matched in a lab. He did what dogs do when their core owner is threatened. He kept returning to the place where his world had been upended. That persistence, when met by officers willing to follow the animal's lead, pulled open a door that might otherwise have remained closed. Both the Dallas and Wilkes-Barre cases underline a common truth. Small biological traces and everyday animal habits can shift an investigation's axis. In Dallas, it was the physical trace on a bird's beak. In Pennsylvania, it was the determination of a dog to remain near the home he considered safe. In each instance, the animal's presence forced a human response. More evidence, deeper questioning, patience with lab timelines that ultimately nudged a case toward resolution. Months after the Boot prosecution concluded, investigators in a very different setting found that an animal's voice could be as telling as its body. In Argentina, the case of Elizabeth Ellie Toedo and a green parrot named Puli illustrated how an animal raised within a household can carry, day after day, an audio record of what life inside those walls was like. Puli had been a fixture in Ellie's apartment, a small green bird that mimicked phrases the way parrots do, repeating the speech it heard most. But the phrases Puli recited were not trivial. When officers arrived at the scene surrounding Ellie's death, they noted that the parrot vocalized lines that suggested coercion and fear, a pleading tone, requests for release, a repeated question about being hit. Recordings made by responding officers captured the parrot repeating those exact words. In a courtroom later, prosecutors and witnesses would point to Puli's phrases as evidence not of a single night's horror, but of a pattern that had been rehearsed in the cadence of daily life. The investigation in Argentina combined those recorded utterances with physical forensic findings. Medical examiners, as reported by court documents, found injuries consistent with sexual assault and strangulation. Neighbors testified to noises and arguments, and family members described Ellie as someone who had, in private, endured a relationship that was fraught with controlling behavior. The parrot's repetitions, "Oh, please let me go," and "Why did you hit me?" as the bird had been recorded, were introduced as a form of contemporaneous evidence, the sounds of the household that an animal had absorbed and could now reproduce. Puli's role was unusual in modern criminal practice, but not unprecedented. Animals that witness repeated interactions often mimic the sounds they are exposed to. A parrot can, in effect, carry a verbal catalogue of phrases that reflect the ambient language of a home. For prosecutors, the parrot's utterances were one more corroborating piece in a case that also relied on forensic biology and witness statements. For defense attorneys, The parrot's mimicking nature presented grounds for questioning the degree to which those phrases could be treated as reliable evidence of an ongoing pattern versus isolated words taken out of context. The Argentine case moved quickly in some respects and remained complex in others. Officers arrested a suspect, names that would be brought before the court and examined in testimony, and the legal process began to unpack how the parrot's recordings fit into a broader evidentiary mosaic. For Ellie's sister and other family members, Pooley's survival became a practical concern. Who would care for the bird who had imprinted on their sister's speech and who had now become an object in a legal proceeding? As reported, Pooley was taken into family care, a decision that reflected both affection for the animal and the logistical reality that the bird, as an attachment to the victim, needed guardianship as the case unfolded. What the parrot case most clearly illustrated was how animals can codify patterns of private life in ways humans sometimes overlook. Pets learn the rhythms and phrases of their owners' day-to-day existence. When abuse is repeated, those rhythms leave impressions not only on human bodies and psyches, but on the speech patterns of animals that live inside that world. In a courtroom, a recording of a parrot repeating the exact phrasing of a plea for release becomes a haunting record. Not a moral testimony, but a piece of circumstantial evidence that can corroborate other findings. As the Argentine investigation proceeded, forensic teams pursued human DNA and other biological traces, and witnesses were called to establish the background of the relationship. The parrot's phrases did not stand alone. They were woven into testimony about the victim's life, about neighbors' observations, and about medical findings. Still, the image of Pooley sitting in a cage and repeating over and over what it had learned inside a world of private violence stayed with those who followed the case. It forced a public conversation about how the mundane details of domestic life sometimes hide long-term harm. The three cases so far, Dallas, Wilkes-Barre, and Argentina, share a through line that is at once scientific and moral. In each, an animal that belonged to a victim became not merely a symbol of affection, but a repository of time-stamped evidence. Blood on a beak, a dog's refusal to abandon a place, a parrot's repeated entreaties. The investigations required patience and collaboration between patrol officers, forensic analysts, medical examiners, and prosecutors willing to present unusual evidence to jurors. Those jurors, in turn, had to weigh the unfamiliar. How does one assess DNA recovered from a bird against more conventional forms of evidence? How does one treat the behavior of a dog as probative rather than sentimental? How does a bench or jury judge a parrot that repeats phrases learned in private? For investigators and advocates, the answer came in methodology, corroboration, transparency about scientific limits, and an emphasis on facts as they could be demonstrated. As investigators moved from one lead to the next, a quieter question followed. What happens to the animals left behind? In the cases described above, surviving pets were absorbed into families or cared for by those closest to the victims. Joe, the golden retriever, went to live with Brian Boot. Pooley was placed with Ellie's sister. In Dallas, where Bird did not survive, the bird's death was mourned as part of the grief that attended Kevin Butler's passing. These outcomes matter. They remind us that animals are not mere props in legal narratives. They are living beings whose fates intersect with human tragedy and whose care is a measure of the community's response. The next case shifts tone again, from a parrot's voice to a tiny fragment that would upend forensic expectations on a small Canadian island. On Prince Edward Island, an abandoned car containing scattered belongings and a pillow would set investigators on a path that required creative science and methodological caution. What began as a field discovery would, as the files would later show, hinge on a single white cat hair found on a suspect's jacket, an unlikely clue that would prompt geneticists to adapt feline DNA testing to the courtroom in a way that many had once thought only theoretical. Investigators at the scene discovered remains some distance from the vehicle and connected the abandoned car to a missing woman, Shirley Duguay. The remote nature of the island community added layers of complexity: tight social networks, overlapping alibis, and a limited pool of animals that complicated statistical assumptions about DNA matches. Dr. Stephen O'Brien, a geneticist called in to assist, faced a question he had not often encountered in legal history: how to translate the presence of a pet hare into reliable statistical terms when the island's cat population shared a limited gene pool. A single hare can do what photographs cannot. It can be a biological bridge between a suspect and a crime scene. But turning that bridge into a court-ready structure required rigorous controls. The cat-hare evidence was compared to a household cat known to investigators, Snowball, and the laboratory used mitochondrial analysis and later nuclear markers to estimate the probability that the hare came from Snowball rather than from another cat on the island. The resulting figure, reported in court documents and later public summaries, was stated as a match with a probability calculation that, as presented by experts, was on the order of 1 in 45 million. That number, dramatic as it reads, was carefully presented with context. The rarity applied under the laboratory's assumptions and sampling frame, and experts made clear the caveats about island ecology and shared ancestry among local cats. The methodological leap in that case was not a matter of wild claim, but of laboratory adaptation. Geneticists had developed the tools to link human DNA to a crime, but animal DNA work, particularly feline nuclear DNA analysis suitable for courtroom presentation, was less common. Dr. O'Brien and his team refined techniques, documented chain-of-custody procedures for animal samples, and included robust statistical explanations so that jurors could understand the probability statements offered. The defense, as is procedural in such high-stakes settings, questioned the assumptions and sampling methods, forcing the scientific testimony to be precise, transparent, and repeatable. Those scientific debates unfolded against a human background, the family and community grieving Shirley Duguay, friends describing her as a neighbor who volunteered time and warmed community events with quiet presence, and investigators following a suspect, Douglas Beach, whose movements and connections were examined closely. The hair on a jacket, coupled with other physical traces and testimony, became part of a prosecutorial narrative that argued for a link between the accused and the victim at a crucial time. What is important to note about the Prince Edward Island case is not just the headline of a first in animal forensic application. History is careful to qualify such claims, but the way diligence and scientific rigor were marshaled to convert a tiny, easily overlooked biological fragment into a credible piece of evidence. In a small community where many households kept cats with overlapping lineages, scientists had to demonstrate that the match was meaningful beyond reasonable doubt. The lab reports, testimony, and cross-examination that followed show how forensic innovation can be both promising and painfully exacting. Each of these cases, Dallas, Wilkes-Barre, Argentina, Prince Edward Island, resolves a common paradox of domestic violence and homicide investigations: the private constraints that keep abuse hidden, and the public, messy work of investigation that must transform fragments of private life into courtroom facts. Pets living in the domestic sphere absorb both the tenderness and the harm of human relationships. When investigators pay attention, those animals can provide leads, traces, and corroboration that otherwise might not exist. But attention is not automatic. In every instance, the path from discovery to conviction demanded more than the presence of an animal. It required detectives willing to follow peculiar leads, lab analysts patient enough to comb through tiny samples, prosecutors who could explain novel evidence to jurors, and communities that would insist on thoroughness rather than rush to judgment. There are questions that hang in these files, procedural, ethical, and human. What constitutes reliable evidence when it comes from an animal? How do we protect the dignity of victims while using the traces left in their homes? How do we ensure that forensic novelty does not overshadow due process? Courts, scientists, and advocates are still grappling with these questions, and the answers are not uniform. In the next part of this story, we will return to the Argentine case to follow how the recorded phrases of Puli were presented in court, and whether the parrot's repetition changed the calculus of witness testimony. We will also pick up the Prince Edward Island file to follow the legal debates over feline DNA, and we will trace the human aftermath, the sentences rendered, the families' responses, and the fates of the animals entwined in these lives. For now, the through line is clear. In all of these investigations, animals, through biology or behavior, altered the investigative path and in multiple cases provided the missing link that made accountability possible. Courtroom doors closed and microphones leaned forward as the Argentine trial began to wrestle with something that, on its face, looked odd. A caged bird, repeating lines that prosecutors said revealed more than mimicry. For weeks after officers found Elizabeth Ellie Toedo, transcripts show investigators had recorded Puli's speech at the apartment and preserved those recordings as evidence. When the case reached a formal hearing, the recordings were played for jurors, and the parrot's voice filled a room that had not heard Ellie's own. Medical examiner Dr. Federico Corusani, called to testify, outlined the physical findings that framed the legal questions. His testimony, as reported in court documents, tied the immediate cause of death to strangulation and listed injuries consistent with sexual assault. Those clinical findings established the violent end. The prosecution then sought to link that end to a pattern of control and abuse that, they argued, Puli's repeated phrases corroborated. Prosecutor Bibiana Santella presented the parrot's utterances not as a stand-alone confession, but as contemporaneous corroboration of a daily reality within the apartment. The recordings included the bird vocalizing again and again, the same entreaties officers had heard at the scene, the equivalent, as the prosecution framed it, of an audio breadcrumb trail. Santella asked jurors to consider the parrot like any other piece of material evidence. It recorded sound. The sounds reflected what had occurred in the household, and in context, with neighbor testimony, with the medical examiner's findings, with patterns of bruising and calls to the building. Those phrases carried corroborative weight. Defense attorneys pushed back along several fronts. They reminded jurors that parrots are mimics by nature, that repetition is not the same thing as eyewitness testimony, and that the parrot's phrases could be sourced to an argument, a song, or even a television program. Cross-examination asked for careful delineation. When were the phrases first recorded? Had technicians altered the audio? Were there independent witnesses who could say the words were said to the victim and not heard in some other context? Those questions are the procedural safeguards that courts rely on when confronting novel forms of evidence. Neighbors and family members took the stand to provide texture to the prosecution's narrative. An aunt described Ellie as someone who valued small, steady acts, cooking for her neighbors, tending plants, and looking after Puli in a way that made the bird famously talkative among relatives. A neighbor testified about late-night arguments, reported as part of the investigation, and another said they had heard a plea the week before the murder. Context that the prosecution argued made Puli's words more than random mimicry. Yet jurors were reminded repeatedly of the difference between corroboration and causation. The parrot's phrases did not by themselves decide the case. Ultimately, the jury weighed the constellation of evidence, not just the parrot's voice. They heard Dr. Corusani explain medical findings, they reviewed phone records and statements from witnesses, and they considered how a pattern of coercive behavior might be reflected in a creature that lives inside a domestic microcosm. The verdict, as recorded in court files, found the defendant guilty of charges that included sexual assault and femicide. The court imposed a prison sentence in accordance with the judgment entered at the trial, details recorded in the public docket, but the length and specifics of that sentence are matters of record rather than embellishment in retelling the investigative arc here. For Ellie's family, the conviction did not undo grief, but it did anchor a public acknowledgement of the harm she had suffered. Pooley, who had outlived the household in which those phrases had been heard, became the subject of both forensic custody and family concern. As reported by relatives during the post-trial coverage, Ellie's sister took responsibility for the bird, both to care for a living creature that had been part of family life and to preserve what the bird represented, a small, living archive of the life that had ended. Pooley's fate, placed into family care, was part of the case's quieter aftermath. An animal whose behavior, once probative, would now be tended by those who remembered the person it had known. The Argentine file reverberated beyond its corridors. Prosecutors and defense teams nationwide watched how the court treated an unusual piece of evidence. Forensic practitioners added questions about how to preserve and present animal-recorded audio. Victim advocates emphasized that the most urgent work was still preventing such situations rather than litigating them after the fact. None of this erased the central fact of the case. A woman was dead, a family was mourning, and a parrot, Pooley, had come to court with a voice that in the end formed part of the public record of what had happened in that apartment. If Pooley's audio memories forced a courtroom to confront the everyday acoustics of abuse, the Prince Edward Island trial demanded that science confront an island's shared history. The white hair found on a jacket, microscopic, easily overlooked, forced geneticists to adapt their language to a community in which many cats shared ancestry and household patterns overlapped. The scientific labor that Dr. Stephen O'Brien and colleagues undertook was meticulous, establishing chain of custody for the hair, sequencing genetic markers, and then calculating what the match meant given the genetic background of a small, endogamous population. At trial, experts explained why a hair could be probative. Nuclear DNA analysis, when possible, provides markers that can be compared across individuals. In Prince Edward Island's case, mitochondrial DNA offered maternal line information, but had limits for individualized identification. What prosecutors presented, with extensive expert testimony, was a multi-step analysis that combined mitochondrial markers, then additional nuclear genotyping, and finally, a population-level calculation. The figure introduced into evidence, the 1 in 45 million statistic, was reported as the laboratory's probability estimate under the sampling assumptions, and with the caveats that the experts themselves emphasized. Defense counsel seized on those caveats, asking whether the sample of local cats used to construct the statistical model was sufficiently broad and whether stray animals or uncounted lineages might undercut the certainty implied by such a number. The judge's rulings in evidentiary hearings became as crucial as the lab reports. Admissibility depended on whether the methods were sufficiently established, whether peer review existed for those techniques, and whether the jury could be guided to interpret probability statements responsibly. Testimony from Dr. O'Brien and other lab personnel clarified the protocols used to prevent contamination, how reference populations were chosen, and why particular markers were considered discriminating in that community. The defense highlighted the island's small gene pool as a confounding factor. The prosecution acknowledged those limits while maintaining that the hair's profile, when combined with other physical and circumstantial evidence, pointed compellingly toward the accused. The accused in the Prince Edward Island case, Douglas Bache, faced a prosecution that rested in part on this novel animal DNA evidence alongside more conventional material, witness statements, geographic links, and other traces connecting him to the scene where Shirley Duguay's belongings had been found. The jury, instructed on the weight and limits of statistical evidence, returned a verdict of guilty. The court's judgment, entered on the record, reflected the jury's assessment that the overall proof met the standard required. Sentencing followed according to the judicial process and appears in the formal record. As with the other cases, this narration focuses on how the scientific leap, translating a cat hair into courtroom probability, was marshaled as part of a prosecutorial narrative that convinced a jury. What followed the verdicts were not only legal orders, but also community reckonings. Friends and neighbors described Shirley Duguay as someone who had contributed quietly to local life, bringing dishes to potlucks, helping at community events, remembered in small acts rather than headlines. For them, the conviction was one closure point among many that grief does not eliminate. Snowball, the household cat whose genetic signature had been central to the analysis, remained a subject of interest. Reports indicate Snowball was known locally and associated with the household in question, but the record does not provide a public accounting of the cat's day-to-day fate after the trial. On that point, the files note indefinido. The precise custodial arrangement or long-term placement is not clearly documented in the materials available for public retelling. Across these 4 cases, some patterns are clear and some remain unsettled. The clear patterns are procedural: careful scene documentation, preservation of animal evidence, chain of custody protocols, and expert testimony that framed probabilistic science in accessible terms. The unsettled elements are often ethical and practical: how to standardize protocols for collecting animal-derived evidence, how to train first responders to see pets as possible sources of forensic material without causing additional harm, and how to communicate probabilistic findings to juries who may be unfamiliar with statistical language. Investigators involved in these cases described procedural lessons in interviews and reports. Officers learned to treat a pet's body or behavior as a potential portal into what had occurred, swabbing beaks and talons when contamination could have occurred, photographing a dog's collar, and following an animal's movement at the scene rather than assuming it was merely distressed, making high-quality, time-stamped audio recordings when a parrot's speech might be relevant. Forensic labs learned that animal-derived material requires adapted protocols, different extraction methods, separate contamination controls, and population sampling strategies that reflect local ecologies. Prosecutors and defense lawyers alike recognize the need for pretrial hearings to clarify admissibility standards for evidence that falls outside the usual human blood or fingerprint categories. None of the above should be read as elevating animal evidence above more established kinds of proof. In every file, courts considered animal-related clues as parts of larger mosaics. Bird's beak blood did not single-handedly produce a conviction. It worked alongside phone records, witness accounts, and other traces. Joe's insistence on staying at a home did not alone convict a person. It opened doors to other evidence that made the narrative coherent. Pooley's phrases did not function as testimony. They corroborated patterns that witnesses, doctors, and records established. The cat hair's statistical match did not close the case in isolation. It became decisive only when considered with the geographic and testimonial material that framed it. There are human costs threaded through each scientific advance. Families endure months of waiting for lab results, sometimes watching a case languish while technicians work on minute samples. Lennox, a neighbor in Dallas, described the strain of watching an investigation tick through lab calendars while remembering quiet, ordinary things about Kevin Butler, the way he shared food with stray cats, or how he fixed a neighbor's fence. Brian Boot carried a dog from porch to hearth, and in doing so, he also carried a private, ongoing testimony to his father's last hours. Ellie's sister took Pooley into a quieter life and had to navigate both mourning and the logistical burdens that come with a living creature suddenly in need of care. For all these families, verdicts and science mattered because they offered narratives that could be told in public, stories of responsibility, of accountability, and of the ways that evidence can make private harms visible. These cases also raised questions about resources and priorities. Laboratories are expensive and their capacity limited. A single case that uses a novel technique, animal DNA profiling, mitochondrial sequencing, audio transcription of a parrot's speech, can occupy scarce time and budget. That raises practical questions for prosecutors and investigators about when to deploy such resources and how to set priorities that balance the need for justice with the realities of finite forensic capacity. In interviews, some forensic directors expressed a cautious optimism. Animal-based evidence can be powerful, but it is not a panacea. Its strongest use is where it corroborates other, more conventional lines of inquiry. There are legal guardrails emerging from these experiences. Defense attorneys have sharpened arguments about sampling frames, contamination risks, and the probabilistic meaning of genetic matches. Judges have grown more accustomed to threshold hearings about methodology, and training materials circulated through law enforcement channels now sometimes include modules on handling animal evidence. None of these reforms is universal, and many departments still lack written procedures that encompass the unique challenges animal evidence presents. In several jurisdictions, policy remains indefinido. There are conversations and pilot programs, but no standardized national code for how to treat pets at crime scenes. If there is a moral through line in the cases told here, it is this: animals, because they live inside the private geography of homes, often carry in their bodies and behaviors traces that humans either overlook or misinterpret. That fact imposes a duty on investigators to look with both scientific rigor and humane attention. It is not enough to treat a pet as mere property or to view it solely as a clue to be catalogued. Investigators who have worked on these files emphasize two parallel responsibilities: to pursue leads where animal evidence might legitimately help establish facts, and to ensure the animals themselves are treated with respect and placed into caring circumstances whenever possible. The legal outcomes, convictions reached, penalties imposed, records entered, represent one form of resolution. But justice in these stories was also procedural and communal. Lab reports that could be explained to juries, neighbors who testified, family members who maintained custody or arranged for care, and prosecutors who framed novel evidence without overstating its meaning. For victims' families, such outcomes cannot restore what was lost. They can, however, produce public recognition and a formal accountability that sometimes matters in the long arc of mourning. What becomes of the animals is an important part of the ending to these cases. Joe, the golden retriever, became a quiet companion for Fred Boot's son, a living reminder of a man who had been part of a tight community. Pooley the parrot went to Ellie's sister, who would live with a bird that had once echoed words from a home no longer standing. Bird, the cockatoo from Dallas, did not survive the injuries she sustained. Her death was recorded with sorrow and remembered at a small gathering of friends who spoke about Kevin Butler's kindness to creatures and people alike. Snowball's post-trial situation remains indefinido in the public record. The files make clear the cat's significance to the case, but they do not spell out the long-term custodial arrangement in a way that can be responsibly reported here. There is, finally, a lesson about humility and method. Forensics advances when practitioners test, replicate, and subject novelty to adversarial scrutiny. The image of a bird's beak, a dog's collar, a parrot's repeated plea, or a single cat hair captures attention because it compresses a complex story into a tangible symbol. Yet behind each symbol lies labor, the careful swab, the controlled lab environment, the expert who explains probability to jurors, the defense attorney who forces precision in assumptions, the judge who rules based on established standards. When that labor is done well, an animal can be more than a companion. It can be a witness, albeit an unusual one. As these files show, animals did not bring miracles. They brought traces, biological, behavioral, acoustic, that when collected and contextualized with care, shifted investigations from doubt to accountability. They forced courts to consider evidence in new forms and pushed forensic science to adapt its tools to the domestic realities of violence and death. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded communities that the private lives of neighbors often hide struggles that deserve attention before tragedy occurs. If this episode has shown one thing, it is the way ordinary affection, feeding a stray, letting a parrot sit on a shoulder, welcoming a dog home, can become entwined with the hardest work of justice. These pets were not props in a drama. They were living, sentient beings whose presence, behavior, and biology helped reveal truths that would otherwise have remained obscured. Their roles complicate how we think about evidence and empathy at once. If you found this episode meaningful, consider subscribing for more true crime stories that explore the intersection of human behavior and forensic innovation. If you or someone you know is affected by domestic violence, please look for local resources and support. There are organizations that can help and community hotlines that can provide immediate assistance. These animals were more than companions. In the quiet or the crisis of a home, they became witnesses whose lives helped tell the truth.